This is a map of Europe, and right here is what's considered the center of power in the continent. It's Brussels, the capital of Belgium, but it's also Brussels, the de facto capital of Europe. Now, technically, there's no official capital of the EU, but there are tons of very important organizations based here to the point it is in all but the name. In what is known as the Brussels European Quarter, you'll find the headquarters for powerful organizations such as the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Defense Agency, just to name a few. A few miles away sits NATO's headquarters, where 6,000 meetings are held each year that shape Western military strategy. So this begs the question, how did a city like Brussels, in a relatively newly established country such as Belgium, become the capital of Europe in the first place? Well, it sounds crazy because it is. In fact, Brussels was never really supposed to be the center of Europe. The story begins in the summer of 1952, when foreign ministers from Belgium, France, West Germany, Luxembourg, Italy, and the Netherlands gathered in Paris to decide where a new organization called the European Coal and Steel Community would be based. The community was meant to bind Europe's economies together, tying the six nations' industries so tightly that another war would be pretty much impossible. Brussels seemed like a logical choice. It was the halfway point between France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, the continent's three most powerful economies, whose rivalries played a role in starting the two world wars, and whose reconciliation paved the way for European integration. But Belgium's foreign minister, Paul van Zeeland, refused. If his government allowed Brussels to host the new institution, he warned it would collapse overnight. His opposition had nothing to do with the European unity, and almost everything to do with Belgium's internal politics. 2 years earlier, the country had been split by a crisis over King Leopold III. See, Leopold had cooperated with the Germans during World War II. It was a decision that led to him being ousted and forced into exile in Switzerland. But in March 1950, a referendum on allowing his return and restoring his powers as a monarch was held, which he somehow won. A lot of people weren't too thrilled about this, especially those in Wallonia, the French-speaking region, and riots broke out in Liège and Hainaut, its industrial heartlands. There were even calls for the creation of a Wallonian Republic. On July 30th, police opened fire on demonstrators, killing 4 people. It was safe to say at this point the country was on the brink of civil war. So just 3 days later, Leopold publicly announced his intention to abdicate in favor of his eldest son, Baudouin, to avoid further bloodshed. The formal abdication came a year later. Still though, Belgium's political class feared the country could fall apart. So when it came to the time when Brussels was asked to become host to European institutions, there was simply no way it would work, and Paul van Zeeland proposed Liège instead. Brussels was simply a political and linguistic time bomb inside Belgium at the time, given the recent royal crisis. It was in the middle of Flanders, becoming increasingly French-speaking. The Flemish feared losing the city, while the Walloons wanted it Frenchified. If Brussels became the capital of Europe, it would have completely changed the balance of power in Belgium, increasing Flemish resistance, possibly having them rejected as their capital. Liège at the time was seen as the better choice for a few reasons. First, Wallonia was the more unstable region than Flanders, because they were the ones who opposed King Leopold III's return. Giving the city a prestigious role would be a consolation prize for Wallonia, as they still saw the abdication of Leopold as a forced compromise, not a true victory. Many Walloons wanted Leopold exiled, not just replaced by his son. The second was that Liège was already fully French-speaking, so Flanders had little interest in it linguistically. The third reason was there were early signs that Wallonia's traditional industries, coal, steel, and heavy industry, were starting to decline compared to Flanders. This would later lead to the economic shift where Flanders overtook Wallonia. By giving Liège an important role, it could stabilize the region economically. And the fourth and final reason is that Liège was an industrial center, so by proposing it, Belgium could argue that the European coal and steel community should be placed where coal and steel were actually produced, not in a political city like Brussels. But lo and behold, no other European government wanted Liège, and with no agreement in sight, the ministers picked Luxembourg as a temporary solution, as a safe compromise. By the end of the decade, the European project had expanded. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 created 2 new institutions, the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community. As it grew, the more Luxembourg felt too small to handle it. They needed a headquarters, but none of the 6 founding members could agree on where that should be. France pushed for Strasbourg, Italy for Rome, West Germany for Bonn, and Belgium, this time along with the Benelux region, was fine to back Brussels. Months passed with no decision. By January 1958, the treaties had come into effect. Officials had been hired, but there was no office for them to work from. In a desperate attempt to break the deadlock, ministers agreed to rotate the EU's presidency between the 6 countries. Belgium went first. Why? Because they went alphabetically, and Belgium was first up on the list. Brussels was never officially declared the capital of Europe, but decisions taken in 1958 locked the city into place. The Belgian government leased a new office building next to the Parc du Cinquantenaire and offered the European Economic Community a permanent space. That same year, Charles de Gaulle was elected president in France. He wanted the institutions moved to Strasbourg, but by then, Brussels had already absorbed thousands of European civil servants. Once officials started working there, it became difficult to move everything elsewhere. The city became the only viable option. In December, the Belgian government expanded the project, purchasing a convent and school to tear down to make space for what would later become the Berlaymont building, the headquarters of the European Commission. If European leaders ever decided to relocate, the building could be repurposed into a government ministry, but no such decision was ever made. Instead, Europe's institutions ended up growing around the Berlaymont. While Brussels was quickly becoming the European de facto capital, not everyone was happy about it, particularly Luxembourg and President Charles de Gaulle, who agreed to Brussels but insisted that some EU institutions stay in Strasbourg and Luxembourg to limit Belgium's dominance. The significance of Strasbourg, I should mention, is because it's been contested between Germany and France for centuries, changing hands multiple times. Placing a major European institution in Strasbourg symbolized lasting peace between the 2 nations. So, in 1965, the merger treaty was signed, which set the stage for everything to the modern day. Luxembourg got the European Investment Bank, kept the European Court of Justice, the Secretariat of the European Parliament, and some departments of the European Commission, while Strasbourg kept the official seat of the European Parliament, where the Parliament holds its official plenary sessions to this day. At the same time, though, it merged the executive institutions of the 3 European communities: the European Economic Community, the European Coal and Steel Community, and the European Atomic Energy Community. This created a single European Commission and a single European Council of Ministers, which established their headquarters in Brussels. This treaty is regarded by some as the real beginning of the modern European Union. At no point during this time was Brussels officially chosen as the, quote, capital, but it basically was at this point. The buildings were there, the officials were there, and the city had reshaped itself to accommodate them. In 2004, that last barrier fell. The European Council, which brings together the heads of government from every member state, decided to hold all regular summits in Brussels. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Well, almost. See, the merger treaty in 1965, while keeping Strasbourg as the official seat of the European Parliament, never actually formalized it. It took until the 1992 Edinburgh Agreement for it to become official, and then the 1997 Treaty of Amsterdam legally locked in this decision, requiring unanimous approval from all EU countries to change it. It's the reason why, even today, the European Parliament still meets in Strasbourg to hold official votes, despite the fact that most other offices and courts are in Brussels. This has led it to being dubbed the traveling circus. See, moving an entire parliament 430 kilometers from Brussels to Strasbourg is a huge undertaking. 720 members of parliament, their assistants, interpreters, and other staff members, as well as lobbyists and journalists, means that this is a big operation. According to the European Court of Auditors, this is costing more than 100 million euros each year, something which many say is a massive waste of money. But it doesn't matter, because changing it from Strasbourg is something France has repeatedly vetoed. It is what it is, and maybe that's for the best, given the significance of Strasbourg. Today, glass towers stretch across Brussels' European quarter. It continues to be the political heart of the country and continent. Nearby the Berlaymont building, the Justice, Lipsius, and Europa buildings house the Council of the European Union and the European Council, where heads of states negotiated things like Brexit withdrawal terms or EU sanctions against Russia. A few streets away, the European Parliament rises above Place du Luxembourg, where lawmakers finalize legislation that shapes the daily lives of 450 million Europeans. Things like bans on single-use plastics and data privacy regulations. Close by is the NATO headquarters, which holds 6,000 meetings there every year, shaping Western military strategy. There's a lot of international activity in Brussels. You can make the case that it's probably the most international city in the world in terms of the impact these institutions have on its own economy. Brussels hosts 38 EU organizations, 120 international institutions, 184 embassies, and more than 2,500 diplomats, making it the second center of diplomatic relations in the world, after New York City, where the UN is headquartered. There is also a greater number of press corps in the city, with media outlets in every EU member state having a Brussels correspondent, and there are 10,000 lobbyists registered. The presence of the EU and the other international bodies has, for example, led to there being more ambassadors and journalists in Brussels than in Washington, D.C. The city's international workforce is almost 50,000. All this political infrastructure transforms Brussels' economy. These international institutions and the businesses that serve them contribute up to 14 billion euros annually and account for an incredible 20% of the entire Brussels economy. These offices and agencies employ 162,000 people, 23.2% of the city's workforce. The EU's presence also drives business tourism. Events like political summits and lobbying conferences and diplomatic gatherings and the like account for 60% of all visitors, many of whom are wealthy with money to spend. Of course though, all this political power focused into one city brings some consequences, some that are very much not transparent, like espionage. All these international organizations packed into just a few square miles makes the city basically ground zero for spies. There are plenty of corporate secrets and classified government reports and high-level negotiations going on. Spying in Brussels isn't new. During the Cold War, Brussels was a frontline in the intelligence war between East and West. The fact that NATO has been headquartered in the city is a big reason for this, and made it a strategic target for Soviet spies. KGB operatives worked under diplomatic cover, embedding themselves in embassies and trade missions while running surveillance on Western officials. Belgian counterintelligence tracked Soviet agents meeting informants in Brussels Central Square, passing documents in cafes near the European Quarter. Western agencies fought back. The CIA and MI6 recruited sources inside Soviet delegations, using NATO's presence as leverage to flip operatives. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, Brussels had become one of the busiest intelligence hubs in Europe. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the spies never left. In fact, they grew in number. According to Belgian intelligence officials, there are more spies in Brussels now than before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Chinese intelligence has especially embedded itself deep within Brussels. Belgian security officials estimate that 1 in 5 Chinese journalists in the city is an intelligence officer, gathering information from EU officials, lobbyists, and corporate executives. It's not just China and Russia that are doing the spying though, but the US and possibly the UK too. Intelligence experts warn that without massive changes, Belgium risks losing its ability to monitor hostile activity, if it hasn't already. Lastly, we need to talk about the biggest threat to Brussels being the capital of Europe. Growing Euroscepticism sweeping across the continent, challenging Brussels' authority and questioning the EU's power over national laws, even though we've seen Brexit end up as a giant mistake. In many countries, right-wing parties promising to curb EU influence have been winning elections, or at least gaining significant ground. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the share of votes in national legislative elections for hard Eurosceptics parties has more than tripled from 4% in 2002 to 14% of the electorate in 2022. If we include soft Eurosceptic parties, their combined vote share has almost quadrupled, from around 7% to 27%. This is no doubt even higher today. In the 2024 European Parliament election, a record 24 EU countries elected at least one member of a Eurosceptic group, the 3 exceptions being Ireland, Malta, and Slovenia. While at some points Brexit seemed like the worst thing that had happened to the EU, similar sentiments are starting to grow in other countries, with movements like Nexit, Swexit, and especially Dexit, which is especially crazy because Frankfurt houses the European Central Bank because it's the largest financial center in the Eurozone. But if countries begin leaving the European Union, then naturally, Brussels being the capital of Europe won't mean much anymore. But for now though, Brussels is still a small city with an outsized influence. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. I'll see you in the next one.